know you're living in a repressive regime when you feel a fear. Even somebody like myself who has a lot of protection, a lot of platform, a lot of like international notoriety, but I really did worry about what would happen if I was going to criticize him, because other people who did were punished and put into prison. But again, like if you have that kind of platform, I think you're obligated to use it in ways that other people can't because of their fear, because if you don't, then who will?
About you that puts you in these coalitions for a time, and then you're abandoned by them and attacked by your former allies, whatever. But you're in this weird position where you're living in a country that the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, at one point threatened to put you in prison. Now,
and I was criminally indicted.
I forgot about that. And now Lula is running your country, I guess, sort of, at least in name. In name. And there's a very left regime in charge, left, whatever that is, but globalist type government. How has life in Brazil changed under this new government, and how has it affected you?
So there's this phrase, Brazil is not for amateurs, which is basically designed to indicate that there's really oftentimes no ideology or no like obvious political alliances. It's very transactional. Usually the people running Brazil are not the president or the elected officials or these permanent power factions, similar to in Washington. And I never wanted to be involved in politics, but my husband ended up as a, elected official. He was first elected as a city council in Rio, and then an elected member of Congress in Brazil. I started a Brazilian version of The Intercept Brazil. So, and I did a lot of reporting during the Snowden thing on Brazil. So I became very integrated into the Brazilian media. He was obviously integrated into Brazilian politics. And so we both were part of this kind of faction that we never really wanted to be part of, but like just takes you there. When the most significant reporting I did was in 2019, where there was this sprawling anti-corruption probe, and the judge who was leading it became this national hero. And when Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, a big break from prior Brazilian elections where usually center left or left wing parties won, he made that judge who led the anti-corruption probe the most powerful person in the country. He was the minister of Minister of Justice and National Security. It was like kind of this fused position specifically for him that put the entire security service under his control. About 2 months into the Bolsonaro presidency, he was a judge, but he then left the judge to become part of the, and he led the probe that put Lula in jail. When Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, Lula was in prison on corruption charges that this judge, Sergio Moro, oversaw and convicted Lula. There's not a jury trial in Brazil, convicted him and then sentenced him to 11 years in prison. I mean, Lula was a two-term president, a giant on the world stage, left office with an 86% approval rating, and they turned him into a criminal, and they arrested a lot of other people on corruption charges, like billionaires and oligarchs, in a way that a lot of people were supportive of at first, including me. 2 months into the Bolsonaro presidency, I got a contact from a source who had hacked into the phones of that judge, prosecutors, the most powerful people in the country, said there was evidence of all kinds of corruption, turned it over to me, the entire file, similar to what happened with Snowden. And we were able, based on that reporting, to expose this judge as one of the most corrupt people in the country. I mean, he used corruption and illegal means to put the people he wanted to in prison, including Lula. And so 6 months after we began the reporting, Lula was let out of jail as a result of our reporting. I became enemy number one, along with my husband, of the Bolsonaro movement. I mean, just it's hard to overstate like the level of threats we got, the attacks on our personal lives, like the fabricated stories, and then ultimately culminating in a criminal indictment that charged me with like 126 felonies as a co-conspirator with my source. So it wasn't a game, and Bolsonaro hated me.
But did you ever consider just running away? You're not Brazilian by birth.
No, but by this point, not only is my husband Brazilian, but by now we have children and they're Brazilian. So, and I'm a permanent resident. I consider America my country. I'm a citizen of the United States. That's the only country of which I'm a citizen, never have been. But the fact that my children are Brazilian, I see it as their country and a country that I want to fight for, not flee from. I never for a moment considered leaving. Absent some very imminent threat, I just would never do that, even if you can't look yourself in the mirror. Like Snowden taught me that a lot. Snowden did something, and so did Julian Assange, that they knew had a serious risk of putting them in prison. Daniel Ellsberg, one of my childhood heroes, did the same. And so that to me became kind of the thing that I aspired to. And like the idea of running away from a threat because you're scared of something and sacrificing a cause you believe is right would just make me look at myself in a very negative way for the rest of my life. I would not want that on my conscience. I wouldn't want to think of myself that way, or my life having been formed by fleeing or by running away out of fear.
Amen.
So it was very trying though. But we stayed, and, everything we did, ultimately ended up, having a huge effect. It changed the course of the country. I mean, Lula was let out of prison. His convictions were reversed. This judge went from universally beloved hero to, a hated figure. He ended up leaving the Bolsonaro government. So that all happened, and we were heroes of the left and hated more than anything by the Brazilian right. At the same time, when Bolsonaro was elected, there started to become this reaction to him, not just by the Brazilian left, but by the Brazilian establishment, by the Brazilian center-right, very similar to the way that in the United States, those kind of never Trump center-right establishmentarians, all of our institutions of authority had this like extreme fear of Trump because he represented a populist uprising, this like challenge to establishment power. The same thing happened in Brazil. And you had this one judge on the Supreme Court, and supported by a lot of others. He was never a leftist. He's not a leftist. He comes from this very center-right politics. He's sort of like a Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell figure. And he became the leader of this effort to crush the Bolsonaro movement and Bolsonaro himself using extra legal means, just like we're seeing in the United States with these fabricated prosecutions of lawfare against Donald Trump. And despite the fact that I was a hero of the left and utterly hated by Bolsonaro and his movement to the point they really tried to imprison me or deport me, I began speaking out very vocally against this judge. And one of the main tactics he used was political censorship. They started imprisoning people for questioning COVID, but particularly for defending the Bolsonaro movement. You started having exiles like journalists and bloggers and activists fleeing the country for very good reason to the United States to avoid prosecution at the hands of this one judge who became completely lawless. But he became a hero of the left because he was basically imposing authoritarianism and tyranny against Bolsonaro and his movement. And this was a guy who, because he was on the center right, was hated by the left for years, as a racist, fascist, all the things they call people when they hate them. But he became, through this consolidation of judicial power and his use of it in ways that are classically authoritarian, as a hero of the left and the number one figure of the hated right. And I was one of the only people who was not a Bolsonarista, who was not on the Bolsonaro right, to speak out. And I didn't just speak out. I mean, I denounced it constantly. I'm a columnist of the biggest Brazilian paper. I was using my column to just attack him constantly. And he was the same kind of hero as that prior judge was, who had the anti-corruption probe, whose reporting we were able to use our reporting to expose. And so overnight, I started to become an enemy of the left and made a lot of new friends among Bolsonaristas, including the ones who were trying to imprison me just 2 years earlier. And I have to say, like, you never really think you're going to see actual tyranny. And this was the closest I've ever gotten. Like, we've had authoritarian things in the United States that have happened. It's what impelled me to write about journalism, the abuses of civil liberties after the war on terror in the name of terrorism, but nothing like a figure of this sort. And this is the first time in my career as a journalist where I ever had a fear of what would happen if I actually criticize this political figure. And you're living in a repressive regime when you feel a fear, even somebody like myself who has a lot of protection, a lot of platform, a lot of like international notoriety. But I really did worry about what would happen if I was going to criticize him, because other people who did were punished and put into prison. And I've been doing it very vocally and loudly since. They've attacked similar people. He opened a criminal investigation into Michael Schellenberger and the journalist who did the Brazil Twitter files. They actually opened a criminal investigation into them. But again, like, if you have that kind of platform, I think you're obligated to use it in ways that other people can't because of their fear. Because if you don't, then who will?
Who is the judge?
Alexandre de Moraes is his name. It's the person that Elon Musk began attacking because, Rumble, which is where my show is no longer accessible in Brazil unless you use a VPN. I can't watch my own show in Brazil because if you try and access Rumble in Brazil, you'll get a thing saying this site is blocked because of how many censorship orders Rumble was getting from the Brazilian courts that they refused to comply with. And that was what Elon Musk vowed to do, was he said, we're getting so many unjust censorship orders that we're going to refuse to obey them, even if it means we get kicked out of Brazil.